forward. But implementation is going to be the key. So 2012 is going to be an important test year for many of our European neighbors for the implementation of what they have already promised. Strong political leadership and strong solidarity within the European Union is absolutely necessary nowadays. Solving the Eurozone's problem will be long time, will be complex, will be very challenging. 2012 is important for EU, for Eurozone, but 2013 is going to be probably at least as important for the global economy, for what we are going to be observing in the United States, especially after the elections this year. Markets, the business world, and all of us, I would say, we are expecting to see some concrete steps forward next year. For the US also, Fed has been working very hard. But if it is only the Federal Reserve trying to solve the problems, it is probably not going to work out eventually. There is now hope for better employment figures, better prospects for growth, but this is not sustainable unless it is accompanied by serious measures on the fiscal side. And now there is probably credit given by the markets until the end of this year, but 2013 is going to be a very important test year for the US economy and policies that will be implemented by the administration next year. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, just as final words, Turkey has a dynamic society, a young society, a robust free market economy, a democratic political system, and a social tradition of reconciling modernity and with our cultural identity. Considering the great shift that is happening globally, considering the historical transitions that's happening regionally, considering the relentless search for a new balance in economy, in geopolitics, the common denominator between Turkish and American interests and objectives just keep growing. We are ready for a deeper partnership in many, many fields. And thank you for your attention.
Deputy Prime Minister Babacan, that was really a fine speech, and I think the topics you hit just show the breadth of responsibilities you share. We have a few minutes for questions, perhaps about 15. Let me just quickly ask one or two of my own, and then if we have time, we'll go straight to the audience. First of all, you're one of the longest-serving economic managers, leaders of the G-20 now. Even at not such an old age. And I wonder if you could tell us, of those items you hit in your speech, what are going to be agenda items? You've had your meetings, had some meetings already with the other leaders. What's going to be the most important thing this weekend? Agenda item 1, agenda item 2. And then on Europe, and maybe it's 1 or 2, are you more optimistic than you were last year, less optimistic than you were last year? How are you looking at Europe and the Eurozone crisis?
We actually just completed the G20 ministerial meeting at 2 p.m. today in the afternoon, and we have already published a communique. But what we have discussed mostly behind the closed doors was about the banking reforms, the need for deleveraging and how it should be managed so that this deleveraging is not going to hurt growth in developed countries. We, as Turkey, we always say that the banks should have just more capital. They should not shrink their balance sheet, but should have more capital for their balance sheets and so forth. And also another important subject was, of course, the resources of IMF, because the IMF has now about $400 billion of resources, and they will need probably at least that much additional. And how to reach that figure? The Europeans have already increased the size of their firewall. But that size was probably at the lower end of the expectations. And now IMF is having more resources by commitments from quite a few members already. So in a way, these are going to be the European firewall, and the IMF, we can also call it a firewall, is going to be important to be ready for some casualties within the next several months or even several years. So this was also another important topic for G20.
Some disappointment about willingness of the U.S. to increase as much as some would like it to increase its IMF.
Well, I think
contribution.
probably there is a fair understanding that this year is a sensitive year for the U.S. So I think we are going to have the patience until the next year and see what can be done. But the U.S. has been the major shareholder of IMF and the World Bank and has always had a fair share of the burden and the costs whenever it was necessary, globally or regionally. So I think the general expectation is that eventually U.S. is probably going to do their own share, but it's probably a matter of timing. That's what we expect at least.
And the view on the Eurozone crisis and where we are now?
The Eurozone crisis, as I have already touched during my remarks, is now it's a wait and see phase that we are in, because decisions have been made, political statements have been made, the leaders have already committed to many promises. Now 25 out of the 27 countries will make changes in their constitution to have a fiscal rule and to target very tight budget figures in order to have debt sustainability. But then these will have to go through parliaments, and we will see if all those 25 countries will be able to make these constitutional changes and commit in such a firm way for their fiscal adjustment processes. So I think it's not easy to prejudge what will happen. And I believe that many investors, market players, they are also waiting and following what will happen. Because the developments in the market indicators after the promises, after the declarations, were not really dramatic. So I think there is a chance of slippage, which the markets are already taking into account.
Well, I think that's it. The markets have always believed, have believed for a long time, that the European Union has been a day late, a euro short. Yeah. And I wonder if you believe that reaction to Spain is showing some of the same. Do you, in your position, where Turkey is so much a player that's affected by this, are you satisfied with the pace of change of Europe, or you still feel that it's a euro short, a day late?
Well, I think what's happening, and it's more of a personal assessment, I would say, but the many European countries, when we look at the period after the Second World War, has not really faced a serious crisis. So when this crisis hit, probably there was quite a lack of experience of how to deal with a crisis. I mean, what kind of steps to take and how fast to take those steps. And during times of crisis, it is very important to do it big and to do it soon. And especially for the new elected governments, it is very, very important to do what is necessary in the first few months. So this has not happened in many countries. So now we have technocrat governments in Greece, in Italy. They also have some opportunity window to move, but if they wait too long, then people will start to ask, well, I didn't vote for you, and you are asking me to sacrifice. So that is going to be probably a difficult period, which we lived in Turkey to a certain extent in our recent history. So technocrat governments are okay, but for a short time to get things done. But eventually elected governments should come in and just explain people what is necessary, why it is necessary, and also ask for sacrifices. It's not easy, because many European countries have been probably living a welfare level above what they could afford. Yeah. So they borrowed, spent, and had an artificially high level of welfare. And this welfare level will have to drop in many countries, and it is going to be painful, it's going to be costly. But this needs a very open communication and tell the very open truths to the citizens about what is needed to be done. Because if this is not done by the hands of the governments, eventually it will be done by markets, but in a very severe way. So the market adjustment is going to be very dramatic and probably dropping the welfare levels much faster and much stronger than it would be otherwise.
Thank you for that answer. Quickly on the Middle East and North Africa, your outstanding economic performance, growing political role, prompted Time magazine to rank you and Foreign Minister Davutoglu among the 100 most influential people in the world. You talked a lot about the Middle East and North Africa. How do you want to use that influence? And maybe drill it down with the specific example of Syria. What a difficult situation, a new time of influence for Turkey. How do you want to use influence there? What are you calling upon, or what would you like your American and European friends to do with you in Syria?
Well, I think our influence is mostly coming very naturally from what we have done in Turkey, because what we have done in Turkey has become a source of inspiration for many countries. In a way, we were able to prove that Islam, democracy, and secularism can coexist and function in quite a good way in a country where 99% of the population is Muslim. So, in a way, the old rhetoric about this cannot function, or the old rhetoric about if you want security, you need a more of an autocratic regime, or if you want stability, democracy is not going to bring any stability. So I will bring the stability for you. So that was the rhetoric of the leaders for many, many decades. So I think what has happened in Turkey has changed the mentality in many, many countries. And also what's happening in Turkey is a homegrown process. It is based on the will of the people. It is based on the trust of the people to an elected government. And this has been confusing the minds of many, many young people in the region. And what is happening in Syria is quite a tragedy, mostly because I would say the international community did not stand as a united front. In the case of, for example, Libya, the situation was different. In the case of other countries, we had case by case very different transition processes. But for Syria, the regime was able to find supporters of probably not what they are doing, but supporters for the continuation of the regime, because for some countries, they had a keen interest to have the regime in Syria continuing, because the alternative would probably hurt their national interests. So that was a big problem for a long time. So that's why I think the 14th of April Security Council resolution was a good, important step forward. The Bashar Assad and his companion, I think they have totally lost their legitimacy, because when a regime kills its own citizens by masses, not by targeting individuals, but bombing cities by Navy ships or using tanks to bomb houses, and this is happening in their own country for their own citizens, then probably they will find it very, very difficult to survive. It's going to be just a matter of timing that things will change in Syria. What was happening also until recently was there was not a credible alternative to the current regime, because if we ask the regime to go, okay, what's going to happen? But now a credible alternative is also being built up, a very representative and stronger national front being more in charge of what is going on in the country. And we expect that the domestic dynamics of Syria could make many changes if the violence stops. Because that's why these observers, UN observers, are going to be very, very important, because if those observers are over there and if the violence will stop, then natural domestic dynamics will do the rest of the job.
What's your advice? Syrian National Council, our Rafi Kariri Center next week will be hosting the chairman and other members of the council at the Atlantic Council. What's your advice to them? What's your most important piece of advice to them?
Get united, be very representative, so that you should have all the ethnicities, all the religions and religious sects in the country with you, and make sure that the international political legitimacy is there, and finally legal legitimacy is there for the opposition. So this is okay. We are calling them opposition, but as I said, there is a need for credible alternative to the current regime, and that's very important for the future of Syria.
We have to be very cognizant of your schedule. You've been very kind to work us in. Let me just take, I'm really sorry, but let me just take one question, that's all. If you could ask them very briefly, and then the Deputy Prime Minister can answer briefly. Thank you.
John Roberts with Platts. Can I just ask Mr. Babacan, Turkey was instrumental in getting the intergovernmental agreement for the Nabucco project when that was live. Now you're promoting the TANAP Trans-Anatolia project. Will it be regulated on the same principles as the IGA sought out for Nabucco? In other words, is it going to meet all the kinds of terms that made the European Union so happy with Nabucco?
And Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, we'll take one more, and then you can answer that very complicated question in 1 minute or less. Yeah.
Hi, Mustafa Tunç from the Representative Office of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus here in Washington, D.C. The Cyprus problem had been one of the hardest to solve problems in the political agenda since more than 40 years. While it was like that, our Greek Cypriot neighbors in Cyprus, they were accepted as full members to the European Union, and they will be taking over the EU Council presidency in summer. How would you evaluate this? How it will affect the relationship between relations between Turkey and the European Union, and would it affect the economic relations in any way? Thank you.
Well, Cyprus problem has been there for many decades already, and there were several very serious attempts to solve the problem in a comprehensive way. The last attempt, the serious attempt, I would say, was in 2004, when Kofi Annan, when he was the Secretary General, he came up with a very comprehensive plan, negotiated by all the relevant parties, and accepted by the governments meaning not only the Greek Cypriot, but also Turkish Cypriot governments, as well as Turkey, Greece, and UK as guarantor countries. But this plan then was offered to a referendum. In the north of the island, Turkish Cypriots voted yes by a majority of 65%, and the Greek Cypriots voted no by a majority of 75%. The Greek Cypriot leaders, unfortunately, right after their agreement around the table, they went back and started a negative campaign for the plan. So that didn't work out. But what happened is, right after that event, Greek Cypriots were accepted as a member to the European Union, and Turkish Cypriots were isolated by the European Union. And that is the case for the last 8 years. And we believe that that is not fair. Turkish Cypriots were the ones trying for a solution, trying very hard to get out of this complex situation because they have incentives for the solution. But the Greek Cypriots, we believe that they don't have many incentives, especially after they became part of the European Union. They are using all the EU funds exclusively for the south of the island. They enjoy the privileges of being the member of the EU, as being the theoretically sole representative of the island, and so forth. And in any kind of solution, they will have to share what they have. They will have to share the government, because there will be a partnership, state and partnership government at the end of the day. They will have to share their EU membership. They will have to share the resources, funds flowing from the EU. And what they will get at the end is probably not that much. So the big mistake, not only in my view, but in the views of many of our European colleagues, was to accept them as a member before resolving the problems. And it's the first time that a new member has a huge dispute of borders. The island is literally divided into two, and you are taking this semi-member, let's say, in the EU. And that problem is now a European Union problem within the European Union. We have not recognized the Greek Cypriots as an official state or as an official counterpart. So during the term presidency of the Greek Cypriots, we are not going to attend the political level meetings which they chair, but our relationship with the EU is going to continue at the technical level. We are going to be represented in all the technical circles or platforms. We are going to continue with our relations with the Commission. So for just 6 months, we are not going to be sitting around the table of politicians, let's say. That's about it. We are committed to the EU membership. We are committed to the process. It's very crucial for our domestic reform processes, and also it's a very important strategic target, important not only for Turkey, but for the EU as well. So we have every reason to push the process forward for our own Turkey-EU accession process. For the question on the energy pipelines, now Nabucco was, of course, a very crucial project, and is still a crucial project, giving an alternative route for the energy needs of the European Union. And the problem, there are, I think, 2 important problems with Nabucco. One of them is just there are so many countries involved. And if even one single country in the chain has a kind of a problem, then the project doesn't go forward. And the second problem is that we still don't have sufficient amount of gas to fill the pipeline. So if there is going to be the pipeline, there has to be sufficient amount of gas. And this has somewhat to do with the relations between Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan, the disputes on the Caspian Sea. But that has also to do with what will happen in Iraq, because it was also one of our ideas to have some Iraqi gas in the Nabucco pipeline. And the situation in Iraq is also quite complicated nowadays. The rift between the Iraqi Kurds and Baghdad government is growing, mainly because of the policies of Baghdad, policies of Prime Minister Maliki himself, I would unfortunately say, following a very sectorial line, not actually doing things for all the ethnicities, religious sects of the country, but a very shy accent of policies, I would say, is hurting the national reconciliation efforts in Iraq. So the Iraqi domestic dynamics also is making it hard, at least for now, to supply gas for Nabucco. So when Nabucco is getting late, then the South Stream is moving on phase by phase, which Russians came up with. But for any project in our region, any energy project, I think it's very important to have an inclusive approach towards Russians, because they have an important role and also many different tools and ways and means of affecting different projects. So actually, when I visited Sergei Lavrov back in 2007, first time, I even asked them, why don't you become a partner in Nabucco? They were quite surprised at the beginning, but as I said, seeing Russia as not as a competitor, but as a partner in the major energy projects in our region is very, very important, I believe. Otherwise, many things are being tried, but then being blocked one way or another.
Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, as you can tell by the audience, we could go on another hour. The problem is you can't. So I'm going to ask the audience to applaud you. I would ask you all to stay in your seats, let the Deputy Prime Minister depart, and please stay in your seats until he's been able to leave the room. But thank you so much. That was a wonderful speech and very engaging conversation.
Thank you.